Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten back in again for Buck Sexton here from the greatest city in the world, New York, in spite of the best efforts of Mayor DeCamio and his ilk to ruin this place. I want to thank you again for joining us. I want to thank Buck for giving me the opportunity to fill his big shoes here in a crazy news week, and we're going to try to cover a lot of different topics today, starting with, well, let's start with alliteration here. Freedom Friday. This is a big day for freedom because 100 years ago, actually, prohibition was imposed on America. So raise a glass to the end of prohibition today. Federalist Friday. We've got a colleague from the Federalist coming up, and we're going to talk about some of the work that some of my colleagues have been doing relating to impeachment, China, and a whole bevy of other issues as well. It's also Freakout Friday if you're a baseball fan like me, and maybe we'll get into some of the reports that have been coming out, but yeah, if you're a baseball fan, you're wondering what the heck is going on. We've had 10% of the managers of major league teams drop out in a 4-day period mere weeks before spring training. It's absolute chaos, crazy allegations of half a dozen, maybe even a dozen teams involved in cheating, players wearing buzzers on their chests, knowing what pitches are coming. I mean, there's corruption in Washington. This is pretty bad corruption in Major League Baseball. This rivals, I would say, the steroid scandal, and it's become such a big topic that's so capturing the imagination. And I think we might have to talk about it a little bit, even though as a Met fan, it's particularly embarrassing and another laugh-out-loud Mets episode. It's also Fraud Friday, and that's what I really want to focus on because originally I wanted to talk a little bit about the deep state and a bunch of the revelations concerning the deep state that have come this week. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this half hour or hour. But as I was coming over to the studio on the subway today, my blood started to boil when I looked at some of the headlines dealing with impeachment. And I mentioned yesterday, I don't really like the idea of talking about impeachment, wasting airtime on impeachment, focusing on it, because I just think the whole thing is illegitimate. And why would we give our sanction to something that is so legitimate and that is so outrageous? And we're talking about basically second and third hand. What did people hear on a presidential phone call with a foreign counterpart? How do we parse and interpret all of his words? Where's the high crime and misdemeanor in using money as leverage? That's actually what foreign policy largely consists of. Just ask Joe Biden. Oh, wait, that's what impeachment is about. One of the things that it's about. Trying to deflect from the actual quid pro quo, corruption, personal benefits for a family member, one of many episodes in a long litany of potentially corrupt Biden family-related behavior. Once again, the left always projecting. They always claim that we are exactly what they are, that we're committing the actual abuses, that they on a daily basis, hour by hour, minute by minute, are foisting upon the American people, you and me. So I'm reading these headlines, and we're talking about Lev Parnas, a guy who's a proven liar already, and he's being fed it on every single television program imaginable. Another savior, the new Michael Cohen, the new Avenatti, the new Mueller, the new Christopher Steele. They come up with a new guy, the whistleblower, until we can't talk about the whistleblower anymore because, oh, by the way, it's exposed that he was colluding with Adam Schiff's office. And he hates Trump, and he has ties to all these different Obama administration officials, but we dare not say his name. By the way, Adam Schiff said that he was an essential witness for them originally. So what happened? His credibility was shot. The whole basis of this entire thing, supposed basis of this whole thing, was a quote-unquote whistleblower complaint. And as I'll show later in the episode today, a real whistleblower actually really does pay severe, severe penalties for coming out and speaking truth to power and taking on those with a vested interest in remaining in power and covering up their abuses. And by the way, that's another meta-narrative here that really isn't talked about enough. All of the attacks on Trump are in some sense part of a rolling cover-up to not expose all of the criminality that's been involved in going after him in the first place. Impeachment is part and parcel of all that. It's been one long rolling impeachment. This is just the so-called formal process. But it's a process, of course, that Democrats are making a total mockery out of. But I'm reading these headlines about Democrats are going to continue, essentially, the impeachment inquiry in the House while it's sitting in the Senate. And then you have rhinos in the Senate, and we need to hold their feet to the fire. And if for no other reason than that, if they really care about the institutions And they care about democracy, even though we're a constitutional republic. And I hate calling it a democracy because the founders didn't believe we were a democracy. And they talked about all of the deficiencies of a democracy. If they really care about fulfilling their duty in that upper chamber, fulfilling their duty as representatives of their constituents, then represent your constituents. You're in the majority for a reason. Representing your constituents means when you have a political adversary that is willing to bend every single rule, to break laws, to lie, deceive, completely tarnish the institutions, hold them to account. Don't let them continue to corrode that institution by participating in this charade. Certainly don't be complicit in the charade. Liz Shout in today's Morning Greatness, a friend of mine over at the American Greatness, she writes in part, the Democrats are still trying to control the process even though they do not technically control the Senate. The Democrats' plan is to simultaneously conduct a parallel trial of salacious arguments, dutifully promoted, endorsed, and showcased by the hacks in their media terror proxies. And as my colleague John Daniel Davidson writes at The Federalist, something else. Even if no GOP senators call for new witnesses, Rand Paul is one of the few attack dogs so far to come out along with Mitch McConnell on this issue, and a few others as well. Rand Paul's point is valid. How on earth can the Senate conduct even the semblance of a credible, fair trial without hearing from the person who started all this? Until we thought better of it, as I noted, House Intelligence Chairman Rep. Adam Schiff insisted it was essential to hear Chiaramella's testimony, purported whistleblower. Senate Republicans could rightly argue that it still is. The Democrats, and these are really important questions, and they ought to be asked over and over and over again. There should be a microphone in every Democrat's face in the House or in the Senate with these questions. Why aren't there? Because they would do it to us. Why do we play with a different set of rules? If they want to destroy you, suicide is not moral. Suicide leaves them, the most immoral, in power, and us under their boot. Couple questions that John Daniel Davidson asks. They really bear repeating. Do Democrats who are presumably interested in the unvarnished truth really expect the American people to be content with the testimony of State Department bureaucrats with second and third-hand knowledge, or law professors, Trump-hating law professors, with strong opinions? After all, we were told this was serious business. So serious that Nancy Pelosi, as I mentioned, handed out pens to everyone after signing those impeachment papers with a huge grin on her face, so giddy, but she was very somber and prayerful. More questions. Moreover, could the American people really stomach the spectacle of an impeachment trial in which Joe and Hunter Biden are at the center of a dispute over whether Trump abused his power, but are never called to testify? Once again, Biden doing exactly what Trump has been accused of. Except for the fact that Trump wasn't personally benefiting. They make it up. A political benefit. Anything that a president does or does not do can be perceived as being a political benefit, potentially. It's ridiculous. Imagine Joe Biden, of all people, campaigning away in Iowa while his rivals are stuck in Washington, litigating a show trial spawned in part by his family's alleged corruption in Ukraine. Could that be part of what this impeachment is about? Could they actually have been trying to draw this out from the House precisely to conflict with the start of the Democratic presidential primary process, so that if this runs into February, Joe Biden's main competition is taken off the trail in those final weeks, days, and hours before the vote tallies start to come in Iowa and elsewhere? You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to ask those questions. What the Democrats are trying to do here is death by an avalanche of propaganda. In fact, that's really been the whole modus operandi. How many subpoenas can we shoot at the Trump administration? Who can we get to come out that's really upset because suddenly there's a president that actually challenges the establishment to go on record and trash that president? By the way, this takes no courage on the part of these people who claim to be so high and mighty and are so sanctimonious. It takes no courage to work in the federal government and then come out and speak out against the Trump administration, because the Trump administration is viewed as alien to the rest of that government, antithetical to the rest of that government. You can look at the numbers. Where do the political contributions come from when you look at Department of Justice employees or State Department employees in 2016? It's like 95 to 99% Hillary Clinton contributions. Why do you think that is? It's not even a Republican-Democrat thing. It's an establishment, anti-establishment thing. And it's another feather in Trump's cap, by the way, that all of these people hate him, because that means they took him at his word, and he has proven he has lived up to his word Let me go off on another tangent here a little bit. You know, when we talk about politicians, we want them to keep their word. Trump has actually kept his word to a larger extent than any Republican president in my lifetime, probably certainly any Democratic president in my lifetime. And if you look at the historical record, look at what he laid out as his agenda. He stuck to it to the best he could in the face of the greatest obstruction we've ever seen, a media that is more vitriolic and hateful than we've ever seen, people marching all over the country from the day the guy was elected, one long-running temper tantrum. The guy's kept his word. He should get some credit for that. Don't we want that from our politicians? We say we do. The question that I have to ask is, understand the way that the battle terms have been set here, the way this political warfare is playing itself out. I mentioned yesterday, Kavanaugh sort of provides the template. It sort of tells you everything you need to know about the way Democrats will fight. They'll use anything and everything they can claw onto as a means of trying to delegitimize and undermine us. They're trying to swamp us by attacking us from every single direction. And I say us, and I really mean us, we the American people, because this is about abrogating the consent of the governed. It's about violating our will by completely obstructing the process, not in a constitutional way, not in a legitimate way, in a patently illegitimate and unlawful way. They are trying to overwhelm us by attacking from every single side, using every single trick in the book, going off the playbook. So here's the charge that has to be put to Republicans, including those who claim to care about our institutions, our values, our norms, our principles. Even those Republicans who really don't like Trump because he upsets their apple cart as well, to a large degree. And that's why I say this goes beyond party, actually. It really goes to the people versus those who are supposed to be our representatives. I would ask that every single Republican senator and member of the House respond, and not on record, but in their thinking and in their planning and in their plotting and in their strategizing. And this goes for President Trump's council, too, which has been announced, some of the members today. It's going to include Ken Starr and Alan Dershowitz and several others as well, on top of Pat Cipollone and Jay Sekulow and the like. If you were a Democrat right now and the roles were reversed, how would you be fighting? Mitch McConnell, if you were Harry Reid or Nancy Pelosi right now, understanding that you don't want to handicap yourself for future battles when maybe you're in the minority someday, and you want to represent and preserve and protect at least some of the fundamental values that deserve to stand in your institution, how would you act if you were them? And that doesn't mean we stoop to the level of immorality, effectively, the lying and the deceiving and the like. But it does mean that you fight them just as hard as they fight you. Mitch McConnell knows every single rule in the book, and probably rules that haven't been written. He knows every single parliamentary procedure. He is nothing else. He's dedicated to two things. He's dedicated to his institution of the Senate, and he's dedicated to ensuring that we have conservative justices. Because that's basically where every legislative battle is really adjudicated at this point. Sadly, because Congress is derelict in doing pretty much anything, except the kind of garbage that they're doing right now. Confirming judges, of course, that whole process is being mucked up by the impeachment. Another reason that this is proceeding right now. So the charge to Republicans is this. If you were the Democrats, how would you fight what you're facing right now? And they ought to fight every bit as hard. When we come back in just a few minutes, and really for the rest of this hour, I want to talk a little bit about the other side of this, which is the cover-up element of it. What is being covered up? How is this fraudulent charade of an impeachment process covering up the real attack on freedom, justice, our individual liberty that's gone on every single day of this presidency and for months preceding it as well? And we'll talk about some other frauds from our political class as well. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We've been talking about kind of fundamental issues that are playing out right now. One of them being this fraud that's being perpetrated, foisted on the American people. And keeping with this alliterative theme of Freedom Friday, Federalist Friday, Freakout Friday, Fraud Friday, we're going to spend most of the rest of this hour talking about another F, the fundamentals of this nation, the first things, the first principles that this nation is built on. And, of course, justice and consent of the governed are the most essentials when it comes to ensuring, protecting, preserving our freedom. That's what government is for. And what we've been talking about in this fraud, under the guise of justice, is a total injustice. If you step back from all the details for a second, and it's very easy to get lost down any of these rabbit holes that are being pursued right now. You know, what does Trump-Russia go back to? What does the special counsel go back to? Really, it was all about trying to find a crime to hang around the president's neck that could be used to weigh him down, weigh us down, and at a minimum, cripple his presidency and hopefully take him out from their perspective, the plotter's perspective. From the perspective of justice, it wasn't even about a double standard in justice. It was about holding the president and those who voted for him to a lower standard of justice than anyone else. He's held to a different standard than any other president in the history of the country. Why? What's the real reason for that? Yes, they hate him politically. Yes, they would say he's uncouth. He doesn't fit into the cocktail parties in Washington, D.C. and in Manhattan. They hate the way he is aesthetically, stylistically. But actually, if he was a Democrat, they wouldn't care about any of these things. What they really hate is that he had their number. He called it like it was. He said what we all felt but were afraid to say or couldn't articulate, and tapped into a vein in this country that you and I feel that there's one standard for Washington and another standard for everyone else. That they don't listen to us. That they rule us, not the other way around. He was unconstrained by that bureaucracy. And so when Chuck Schumer said that the intelligence bureaucracy can get you 6 ways from Sunday, first of all, it should terrify every American that a senior senator would say something like that. Second of all, it should terrify us that it seems to be true that actually our intelligence apparatus, our national security apparatus, would be weaponized. But also it tells us that they viewed him as an existential threat, and they were sort of laying down a red line. Should Trump-Russia have ever been pursued, based upon what we know? No. Should a special counsel ever have been called? No. Should the narrative of Russia being tied to the elections in the first place ever have arisen? No. Should we have been introduced to the concept of the Logan Act? No, except maybe with John Kerry and Iran. Should a national security advisor's call with a foreign counterpart during a presidential transition have been leaked? No. The list goes on, but the core of it all is that the president was held to a different standard than anyone else, probably to a lower standard than the average citizen, all in a bid to protect their power and to preserve their prerogative and their agenda. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we come right back. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and there's been a whole bevy of news that you might have missed this week and over the last 10 days, let's call it, while the impeachment charade is going on, and then there have been actual achievements like the passage through the Senate of USMCA, like the China deal, all sorts of positive things for the American people, covered by this cloud that the media has helped create of the impeachment charade. There's also, as I mentioned, the fact that the impeachment charade creates cloud cover over the opposite side of all of this, which is the deep state's own malevolent acts. And no heads have really rolled yet of anyone significant. It's the most we've seen is basically slaps on the wrist from an inspector general who will never go so far as to call a spade when he says, look, there are 1,000 acts that all point in one particular direction politically, but we can't find any political bias. Can't detect it within them. Okay, that's what an IG does. It's not their job to adjudicate it. They are political actors themselves as well. They're appointed by presidents. Everything points in one direction when it comes to the reverse side of the coin of all the attacks on Trump, which is anyone else going to be brought to justice on that side? While Trump has been dragged through the mud his entire presidency, while everyone in his orbit who's ever been in the same room as him, who's ever been within earshot of a cough, has been investigated, spent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars legally defending themselves with no recourse, no repayment. Talk about injustice. Talk about chilling political opposition in an attempt to stop someone like Trump and those around Trump from ever potentially residing at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue again. There are all these stories on the other side that are mounting that really deserve our focus. So the first one, the FISA court appoints a man named David Chris. What do they appoint him to do? Well, he's supposed to look into all of the issues surrounding potential abuse of the FISA court relating to the Carter Page wiretap, which, as we know, based upon the IG report, there were 17 material omissions and inaccuracies. Basically, it shows that Carter Page should have never been investigated in the first place. And of course, Carter Page was the backdoor that they used to get into the Trump campaign. Even though, by the way, Carter Page himself, not disclosed, I believe, in the FISA applications, had been a source for the U.S. government in the past to try to take down Russian officials. Of course, they covered that up. And of course, the Steele dossier played an integral role in it, and the reporting on the Steele dossier that they used to show further evidence when it was all circular. Part of basically the fraudulent FISA applications pushed on the court, used to spy on an American citizen, used to spy on a presidential campaign of a candidate they all hate. So who is this David Chris that's appointed to look into this abuse? Well, and this is Jonathan Turley talking here, so a leftist civil libertarian lawyer. Allegations that Chris was one of the most public advocates for rejecting allegations of FBI abuse. In a city where you can throw a stick and hit 10 lawyers, says Turley, Fisk, the FISA court, went to someone who insisted that allegations of abuse were nonsense and should be rejected. If the court was seeking to assure the public, it has added a new controversy for those who see a deep state response to reforms. Yeah, I'll say. Chris served under the Obama administration. He originally served under the Bush administration and the Justice Department. One of the loudest critics of the Nunes memo. The Nunes memo that was vindicated after he was attacked mercilessly through this whole thing. Another politician called a Russian stooge who's shown real courage during this and is one of the real unsung heroes, undoubtedly. Took on the entire intelligence community, by the way. As Chuck Schumer will tell you, that gets you in real trouble in Washington. Here's what Chris said. The Nunes memo was dishonest, and if it is allowed to stand, we risk significant collateral damage to essential elements of our democracy. Chris specifically denied the claim that the FBI misled the court about Christopher Steele, a claim that has now been proven to be true. Chris also maintained that, quote, these applications already substantially undermine the president's narrative and that of his proxies. And it seems to me very likely that if we get below the tip of the iceberg and into the submerged parts and more is revealed, it's going to get worse, not better. And it would potentially be dangerous to disclose additional information because some of this relates to ongoing investigations. No, actually, it would be dangerous to disclose additional information because that would show the corruption that was involved. Naturally, Chris has also been a prominent critic of President Trump, claiming on Twitter that the walls were closing in. You got to see some of these mashup videos of the walls closing in because the walls have been closing in every week for the last 3+ years. Must be the tiniest room in the world that President Trump resides in right now. Amid the Trump-Russia investigation, Chris had written that Republicans had, quote, falsely accused the FBI of misleading the Fisk in its wiretap applications to spy on the Trump campaign. He stated that an allegation that was all but debunked by the special counsel's report and the inspector general's report. That's how he characterized it. How can this, talk about the inmates running the asylum, how can this be the person looking into abuse at the Fisk? Only in government would this ever transpire. So there are a couple Republicans who are fighting back on this. Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, are asking the presiding judge at the Fisk now, Judge James Boasberg, who, of course, Obama put on the second highest court in the land, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Gee, it seems like we're in really good hands if that's the person who's sitting in this seat right now. They asked some questions that I think we'd all like to know the answer to in a letter to him. So they asked, can you identify all the candidates you considered to serve in this role to assess the government's response to the order that the judge who preceded Boasberg, who used to be at the top of the FISA court, Judge Collier, she said there were all these abuses perpetrated by the FBI in the court. Chris is supposed to look into them. So who else was on the list of potential candidates for this spot? They couldn't find one person who might have been a little bit skeptical of the FBI and or potentially corruption of the FISA court itself. Please explain whether the FISC reviewed and considered Chris's writings and statements about Carter Page and the FBI's electronic surveillance of Mr. Page prior to appointing Chris. They asked to account for considering whether or not Chris's comments about the Intelligence Committee that Devin Nunes chaired mattered. All sorts of questions that we deserve to have the answers to. A list of 9 questions. Here's maybe the most important one, the last one in their list. Please explain with specificity what disciplinary action, if any, the FISC intends to pursue for attorneys who knowingly filed false or misleading information with the FISC with respect to applications to surveil Carter Page. Because that in the end, and we'll talk about this in context of some of these other stories as well, that is sort of what it all comes down to, is anyone going to pay a price for this malfeasance? And if you look at what the FBI said, because the FBI was forced to address the FISA court and basically explain, how are we going to prevent this in the future? Well, what did they say? Essentially, Christopher Wray put together a list. Here are 12 steps that we're going to take. One of them included making a case study about this fraud that was perpetrated on the FISA court. Yeah, a case study. That's going to stop agents from doing this, abusing the system in the future. Really. Here's the other interesting piece of news this week. This came out last night, interestingly. The New York Times reports James Comey is being investigated for leaking. Not the first time he's been investigated for leaking, by the way. Remember, the Justice Department Inspector General previously found Comey was a leaker and violated FBI policy in the handling of FBI memos, including material containing the code name and true identity of a sensitive source. So here's how the New York Times frames this. The case is the second time the Justice Department has investigated leaks potentially involving Mr. Comey, a frequent target of President Trump who has repeatedly called him a quote-unquote leaker. The timing of the investigation, and I'm reading here from tweets from one of the reporters who's bylined on the article, Adam Goldman at the Times. He tweets, the timing of the investigation could raise questions about whether it was motivated at least in part by politics. Let's stop for a second. First of all, there's the Trump pounces version of this, which is the preferred narrative when it comes to any time any of the deep staters themselves are implicated in anything and questioned about it. We should also ask probably who leaked this in the first place and why did they leak it and why now? Interestingly, of course, it comes up right against impeachment, so it won't really be focused on probably in the headlines as much as it otherwise would be, and right before a Friday and the weekend. But then there's the other element, which is, like I said before, the Inspector General in the Justice Department puts forth these reports that lay out chapter and verse factually and does it in the most conservative fashion possible. Here's all the corruption, abuse, fraud, malevolence, totally unacceptable behavior in the highest stakes sort of investigations that we could possibly have. And then he says, in spite of the fact that every piece of behavior forms a fact pattern that clearly points in one direction, and people's text message implicated in it show clearly they hate the president's guts. Besides the fact that on substance, they probably hate the president's guts as well. It all points in one direction, but he says we can't assess whether or not there's political bias involved. Sort of like when Peter Strzok was on the stand, confronted with his words as a person who, I believe it was either he or his partner in arms, talked about how they could smell the stench of Republican Trump supporters in a Walmart or something like that. that these people are supposedly unbiased and it never leaked into their work, and everything they did was absolutely above board. The New York Times, effectively a deep state rag right now on any story implicating the deep state. So consider the medium. They say, this brings into question politics. How come it's only politics when we bring them into question? It's never politics the other way around. It's always unimpeachable and above board. Oh, but if you actually want to investigate them, well, we're weaponizing and abusing the system. Once again, they engage in mass projection. It's a disease on the left. And so law enforcement officials are scrutinizing at least 2 news articles about the FBI and Mr. Comey, published in the New York Times and the Washington Post in 2017. How can it possibly be that only they get to question the political angle here? And by the way, is it the political angle, or is it actually that we really want justice and they're trying to deflect by claiming politics? You know, they love to use politics, for example, when the House is controlling the impeachment process. But then, and by the way, of course, impeachment is a purely political remedy, not a legal one. High crimes and misdemeanors. But in the Senate, it has to be strictly legal. Once again, they're totally inconsistent because the one consistency is they play to win. Dirty or clean, invoking the Constitution or shredding the Constitution, political process or legal process. Are we up to the task to confront them, to compete against them? Some senators last time around in Kavanaugh mustered some courage and fought. Are people ready and willing and able to fight today with the same, if not more, intensity? Because they're trying to kill us politically. That is what they are trying to do. I want to point out another element of this Comey story. They don't mention Attorney General Barr by name here, but there have been a slew of articles recently attempting to challenge Barr, claiming that he's a Trump stooge, in spite of the fact that he's been very consistent throughout his public career as a defender of executive power. And by the way, we can debate whether or not his positions are ones that we agree with. Some people, myself included, believe that Congress ought to have more power in certain areas. But it's debatable. He clearly has a well-reasoned, cogent, consistent argument that he's followed throughout his career. So it's not about Trump. And if you ask him, and as he said before, it's actually about the principles. It's not about the person. It's about the rule of law, not about the man. Why do they try to make this about a politicized Department of Justice? Well, in part, it's another data point that they're trying to connect for us to undermine Attorney General Barr, thereby undermine and delegitimize the investigation that he's directing under U.S. Attorney Durham to protect themselves down the road. Because if Durham is truly pursuing justice and any of these people are brought to justice, it's about trying to muddy the waters by claiming politics to protect themselves from real justice. And remember, this all started, I wrote an article about this at The Federalist. I urge you to go back and check it out. When there was the freakout, when Attorney General Barr talked about his belief that the Trump administration was spied on, and he got attacked for every which way from that. It's one in a series of attacks on Attorney General Barr because, sort of like Trump, he is unconstrained by the establishment political norms. Attorney General Barr has accomplished everything he wants to in public life and private life. So he's doing this because he genuinely believes in this job and actually protecting the rule of law as he sees it. And as the president, that yes, he does represent as his appointee, sees it. These attacks are all about undermining the counter-investigation to expose the corruption. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. I want to just tie a little bit of a bow on what we've been talking about, which is on the one hand, fraud, and on the other hand, freedom and the importance of justice to freedom. I want to ask some questions that we need to assess and hopefully will become very clear over the rest of this year and probably into the second Trump term if things continue the way that they are. Will any of the people at the highest levels of the FBI, DOJ, CIA, ODNI, State Department, the FISA court, or any of the other alphabet soup of agencies and institutions pay a price for their involvement in this, the greatest political scandal in American history, arguably? We're going to talk about this in the last hour today at length because there's some late breaking developments on this. Will General Flynn receive a modicum of justice beyond, at the end of it all, likely a pardon and be able to restore his good name? Can we trust a law enforcement apparatus with the power of a FISA court when it considers those who challenge the establishment to be the ones to target and investigate rather than, say, I don't know, jihadis? It all feels like a rigged deck, with the exception of a president, an attorney general, a handful of senators, and a handful of members of the House. And what does that say about the disconnect between our political class and the people our political class is supposed to represent? What I would suggest is that if serious heads at the tops of these bodies, former most of them, don't roll when they all get cushy jobs and appointments and are feted and made rich for their malfeasance and wrongdoing, there's only going to be worse in the future. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We're going to talk China in the next hour. Back after this.